Hey everyone, welcome to the live stream tonight. We're talking about a forgotten apostle maybe that you haven't heard about, and that is Elder John W. Taylor, and who is the son of President John Taylor and the father of Samuel W. Taylor, who wrote books like The Nutty Professor and Flubber that later turned into motion pictures that are still getting royalties to this day, I'm sure. And we're excited to have those tuning in live on this live stream. And there is obviously the live comments. I will be keeping my eye on those. If you have a question that comes up, a thought, a story, I'll do my best to keep my eye on those questions. And if it is a question, maybe for our guest or for me or those that are talking here, maybe put a big capital Q at the beginning so that I know that it's a question, and then that'll help me find those questions and not lose them. But we'll probably lose some questions as well. But today I'm welcoming back Bryan Summers, who was just on the podcast a few weeks ago. If you haven't heard the Acts of James E. Talmage, I forgot his name for a minute. Bryan did a phenomenal job walking us through some fun stories of James E. Talmage. So Bryan, how are you?
Oh, doing great. Thank you. Good to be here.
Cool. Now you're from you live in St. George area currently?
In St. George,
Nice. Former bishop,
Yep.
Current super fan of Leading Saints, and here you are.
Love Leading Saints.
Good. Nice. And yeah, those looks like Kimberly here. She's tuning in from Wisconsin. So if you are listening in, maybe just put where you're from. I'd love to hear it, and we'll get an idea of the reach we're having. This is like, I mean, there'd be some people on the East Coast that are just crawling into bed right now, and it's like we're the Johnny Carson for them. There's a throwback for you.
That's right.
Well, Bryan, this is fun. As we're talking about doing a podcast episode on Leading Saints. We obviously James E. Talmage was an easy one to pick, but we talked about different names, and you brought up this obscure apostle that I'd never really heard of, which is John. Is it W. Taylor?
John W. Taylor.
Okay, John W. Taylor. But let's have you plug your, and we'll do this at the end as well. But plug your X account where you are actively tweeting about the acts of various apostles.
Okay, yeah, very good. So I started last June. Every day I do a story from the life of the apostles, and so I started with, I think Bruce R. McConkie was the first one, and I just went through stories from his biography. And once I'm done with that apostle, I'll move on to the next one. Right now we're doing Orson Hyde. Wow. We just finished. Yeah. Oh, it's fun. Yeah. He's got some great stories that I had never heard before.
And he's number 5 as far as the apostles in the latter days, right?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the first. Cool. And he's got one story where he's up in this. I cannot wait to write this one. It'll be in a week or so. But he's up in the Sierra Nevadas, near where the Donner Party, where that all happened. And he gets caught in the snow, and he's there for days, and he almost dies. And his mother, who had died when he was 8, way before the church was established, came to him and helped save him. Just helped keep him alive.
Wow.
And it was really touching. It's almost like a Lion King story or something like that.
Yeah.
Really, really touching. I can't wait to share it.
That's cool. Well, all right. So where's a good jumping off point for John W. Taylor, the son of President Taylor, who was an apostle? And I mean, there's excommunication in his story. There's polygamy in his story. There's right. So, I mean, where do you want to start?
Okay. So this is one of the tougher, like James E. Talmage, every story there is just a wonderful, excellent story. This one deals with some of the tougher issues in our history. And, so just be aware of that. But there's some real wonderful stuff in here and some really faith promoting. I think he really does some very heroic things at the end of his life. But other than that, I mean, he is a fascinating character, an absolutely fascinating character. So yeah, this is John W. Taylor. And this is him when he was older, and he was people talk about how good looking he was. He was just really charismatic. Yeah. He was really, really good looking.
That mustache, I wouldn't want to get in a fight with that guy.
No, that is a tough looking mustache. And he put the mustache on because he looked so young when he was called as an apostle. He was called like when he was 25. He was very, very young. And then he wore the mustache for the rest of his life. But his his son wrote a book. His son was 8 years old when he died, but he remembered his dad. I mean, he had a lot of experiences with his dad. And his son was a phenomenal writer. Like you'd mentioned earlier, he was hired by Disney. He'd written the Absent-Minded Professor, and they hired him to write the screenplay, and he wrote the sequel, The Son of Flubber, I think it was. And so the guy who
Yeah,
wrote that,
here's his son. Oh, I lost it here. His
yeah,
that's his son, Samuel W. Taylor, right?
yes, and he's a phenomenal writer, very very funny. He's a lot like Mark Twain. Some people have called him they used to call him the Mormon Mark Twain. I guess now the church is Mark Twain, is what you call him, and he's just a phenomenal writer. So this book, Family Kingdom, is just it's a miraculous book. So he wrote a book about his father for a national audience. It was printed by Simon and Schuster in New York, so a huge company, did very very well with both members and non-members, and it is just miraculous. It's really funny. It's really big hearted. It's really warm. I've got a theory that the best books about apostles were written by the sons. If you get a book that was written by the son of an apostle, oh man, you just feel like you know that guy when you finish reading it. And this book is that way too. This book is absolutely that way. So I recommend this book to everybody. It's out of print. It usually costs about $100 to
Yeah, did
buy
you
it
just
on
get it like
Amazon.
on Amazon or eBay? Because I
Yep,
perused a little bit there, but I better jump on this before
before it goes
everybody
up.
else is
Yeah,
going, right?
right. Before inflation
Yeah,
pushes the price up.
that's right.
So it's 100. Yeah, it's about $100. You can get it on Amazon or eBay. I found this copy for $25 in a used bookstore, and I
Wow,
jumped on it. I was so excited to get it. Um, but yeah, Samuel Willie Taylor is an interesting guy
cool.
as well. He left the church, and for most of his young adult life, he was out of the church. He was what he called an eating Mormon, which means he'd show up for the potlucks and stuff at his church in Northern California. And he was a little scared when Family Kingdom came out that he might get excommunicated. He just didn't know. He didn't know. And so he just sort of quietly waited. And when he didn't, and and if you read it, you know he wouldn't. It's a great book. But Hubie Brown really liked it. Hubie Brown was a fan of it, and and so Samuel came back to church, and he and his wife, about 5 years after that, started coming more regularly, and then eventually they were sealed, and just active members for the rest of their life.
Wow, that's a great story.
Yeah,
Just it's sort of that slowly gravitated back to the church and engaged
yeah.
with the ordinances. That's cool.
It's super cool. He told a really cool story in one of his other books about when he was in World War II. He's like a 36-year-old, and he was in World War II, and there was another member that was in his regiment, and everybody was told they had to drink the coffee because the water there was so dangerous. And Samuel E. Taylor, the way he put it is like the coffee was so weak it didn't even feel like a sin for him. But this other member, he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. Every time he needed a drink, he would say a prayer, and he would take a drink. And Samuel said, the whole time he was there, never got sick.
Oh wow.
He did just fine. And so one of the cool things about Samuel Willie Taylor is that even though he's writing for like a national market, he was a skeptic in a lot of ways. Like he was not somebody that just towed any party line. He was a bit of a maverick in that way. Is that he really in his books, if he was writing about somebody that believed in miracles, he would include the miracles. In Family Kingdom, he included the miracles that happened to his family. And so it's a really interesting, like, I don't know if there's any other book that's quite like this. And it's by far the funniest, the most humorous, sorry, not funny like God, but humorous LDS book there is out there. So
Yeah.
yeah, I can't say enough highly.
Because that was his profession. He was a witty writer, writing fun, like Flubber and the Nutty Professor, right? Those are fun
Exactly.
stories. Yeah.
Yeah. And I tell you, Family Kingdom would make an amazing movie. Man, if anybody out there is a screenwriter or filmmaker,
Yeah.
just take a look at it. Just see what you think. I think it'd make an awesome movie.
That's cool.
So
Awesome. All
yeah.
right. So where do we start with John W. Taylor?
Okay, so when he was born, and this I don't know what even to think about, but he was born during when Johnson's army came into Utah, and so all of Salt Lake City got up, moved to Provo. So it was pandemonium down there in Provo because you had basically you had a bunch of refugees. Actually, they were coming out of Salt Lake County down to Utah County, and it was hard to house them. And so the only thing it says about his birth, he was born down in Provo, is that he was born in a chicken coop.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, I don't get it. You know what I mean? I'm not there. There had to have been a reason why. It must have been a new one. It couldn't have been an old dirty one. But for whatever reason, maybe there was more privacy in the chicken coop, but it just says that in another history, the history of John Taylor Sr., and it doesn't say anything else about it. I can't find any other information about it. So if anybody knows, let me know. But that was how he was born. So he was born during that time, during Johnston's army. And one thing about this book, Family Kingdom, is it's told Samuel Willie Taylor was a child of his of John W. Taylor's third wife. And so most everything in there is experiences from his third wife, Nellie. And so there's actually a lot about him we do not know. One of the other families had planned to write a book. And at one point, they were going to let him use the material for it, but they changed their mind. And so he took his mom on a long road trip, and just heard all the stories. And that's where we get everything. And so it's really structured that way. So you know how if you pass away, like if I were to pass away and one of the kids were to ask my mom about stories when I was a kid, it's probably about 5 or 6 stories that she would know because I tell all the time. And so in the book, you sort of have that. You have the 5 or 6 stories from his youth that she must have known. For instance, when he was like 8 years old, he was out fishing. He was out fishing in one of the creeks, and there was a Native American boy that taught him how to cook the fish without a fire. And that's all it says. I don't know how you would do that, but he taught him that. And then when it was time to go home, the Native American boy, the way it was written, he's like, "Oh, this is home out here." And that sounded great to John W. Taylor. He was like, "Yeah, of course. I mean, why, you know what I mean? Why do you need to go home at night? You go home when you want to go home." And so he stayed with this Native American boy for 2 weeks out in the wilderness, just eating, fishing and having fun and exploring. And after about 2 weeks, he got really homesick, and he went home. And his mom saw him. It was just like, white in the face, and just like, oh, just so glad to see him. And he found out that there was, hundreds of men out in the mountains who had been looking for him, and it just been like a major thing. And he didn't see what all the fuss was about. He just, and he was kind of that way his whole life. He was kind of one of those things that, or like, he just enjoyed the moment, and he went into it.
Yeah.
And yeah. And so when
And
he
just
was
one note here that I found today as I was exploring him a little bit is that he was one of 34 children that President John Taylor had, right? So
yes,
because obviously John Taylor was a polygamist, so lots of
yeah,
kids, right? So it's easy to think like, oh well, of course the the son of a prophet became an apostle, but no, there were 34 of these kids.
yes. And he was the only he was the only one. And it was a lady in his ward when he was a teenager actually prophesied that he would become an apostle.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, and John W. Taylor took that to heart. Like he heard it, he believed it, and he prepared for it. Like he really took that seriously. He made sure that he had a relationship with the Savior. He even talks about that briefly in the book. About that. And so he makes sure that he knew that the Savior was actually the Savior. And he was not a good student, but man, he studied those scriptures so he would know them forward and back. And he almost did a Heber J. Grant where he made sure that his penmanship was good. And he just decided to start dressing really nice and just making himself look good, like presentable. And so he really prepared himself for that. Yeah.
That's cool.
So yeah.
What's next?
Oh, okay. Well, on his mission, there was kind of a cool story too that they told. He was in the South. He was in the South, and he was really good about just working side by side with the Southerners. So he just realized that that's what would people would be attracted to that. And so he was a laborer out there, and he wasn't afraid to go out and just meet people. And he was in a town looking for food with his companion. But back then they went without purse or script, and his companion was like, "Hey, I don't think we're gonna have to go to the next town." It was late and it was dark, and he looked at a house and he's like, "Oh, they'll feed us." And so he went over to the house and he knocked on the door, and the people came out, and they were not warm and friendly, but he promised them, "If you give us a meal and a place to sleep tonight, you will have a dream that will tell you that we are messengers of, that we are from the Lord."
Oh man, I never tried that one on my mission. That's
Oh man,
interesting.
that would be risky,
Those
I
are-
would think.
Yeah, those are such cool stories where they're just like, I mean, so bold, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, faith
So,
filled. That's awesome.
so bold. And his companion actually was nervous all night. That's what it says. Like he was like, "Okay, we made this promise. Please let that happen." And it actually did happen. They had a dream where they were told that these were messengers from God, and they joined the church. They became converts. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow, that is so cool. And
Yeah.
where did you say he served his mission?
In the South.
In the South. Okay.
Yeah, he was in the Southern States mission. Yeah, so he served two missions. He was a mission president later in Denver, Colorado, while he
wow.
was an apostle, but he was in the South.
Huh.
And it's kind of interesting. In Denver, Colorado, it was the exact opposite. Like they would only listen to you if you acted like a minister. So he actually dressed up like he was a minister, because otherwise they wouldn't. He did the exact opposite. He saw what the people would listen to, and he just became, he did that. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Cool. That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. We just going like chronologically through his life, or
Yeah, just stories that I absolutely love, if that's okay.
Please keep going. This is great.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about a few reasons that people loved him, and people really did love him. They called him the people's prophet at the time. And there's I've never read any of his talks. I need to see if they're anywhere. They're after the Journal of Discourses, and they're before, I think, what you can get, where I've seen talks. But there is in the book just a little snippet of his talks. He's really, really charming. He's really charming. I can just imagine you hear this and you just know how people react. And so he was talking to a sort of like a young single adult congregation or meeting. And he goes, "Get married. You men are only half men without wives. And don't be bashful about the girls. They're just as anxious to get married as you are. Look around you, men, at the girl sitting here. Pick out the one you'd like. Now watch her. If she smiles, she'll listen to a proposal." Well, look at that. Every girl in the place is smiling. And now I'll tell you if she'll accept you. If she laughs now, she will. Well, brothers and sisters, it looks like we're going to have a flock of marriages.
Sounds like your typical YSA bishop. This is great.
Really
Every
does
YSA bishop's writing that down. I got to try that one on Sunday, right?
Yeah, things don't change. I think so. You can imagine somebody saying that now. Yeah.
Yeah. That's funny.
So,
that's cool.
Yeah, but he was also, and I think this is actually a likable thing too, is he would say exactly what he thought. You always knew where he was. There's like nothing duplicitous about him. And so even if it stepped on toes, and this made me laugh the first time I read it, but they were having a meeting of the apostles, and one of the members just had joined, or just had been called. It was his first meeting, and they went around the room, and everybody was just saying, nice things about him, welcoming him, like you should, and like you want to hear in a new quorum. But when it come to John W. Taylor's turn, he said, "All new babies look alike to me. They're red and ugly. They have to be tended, and they do a lot of bawling." And that was it. And then I moved on to the next one. And actually, when I became a bishop, that quote, because I read this about 10 years ago, that quote actually was really, really helpful to me. Like if I'd made the goofy mistakes or whatever, or I just did something that was like, oh, what was that all about? I always thought about that, about the new babies. I was like, oh, I'm just in the infant stage of being a bishop. So I always just actually took a lot of comfort from that.
That's cool.
From that
I
line.
like that.
So, and he was unflappable. He was absolutely unflappable. There was one night his wife, Nellie, talked about waking up and there was a thief going through their like chest of drawers or whatever.
Hmm.
And she was like terrified, and she wanted to wake John up without alerting the thief. And so eventually she gets him up, and Elder Taylor just says, "If you're looking for the jewelry, it's the second drawer on the right." And the thief just like probably he had a heart attack and just jumped out the window, or ran
Yeah.
out. It was there. And then Elder Taylor just fell right back asleep. He was just out, and his wife was up all night still terrified. And so he's very, very brave man. And you'll hear stories like this from a lot of people. So I think this happens, not all, well, I mean, it's rare, but it happens enough. There's always stories like this one. But there was a time when he was sent to call a bishop, and there were two factions in the ward that did not like each other at all. And while he was there, he was counseling with them, and they were mostly doing the talking in the ward. Everybody was there, and he wasn't looking at him. It didn't seem like he was listening too much. He was sort of there with a blank look on his face. And then in the middle of it, he looked up, and there was a man just sitting in the back that wasn't a part of either faction. And he pointed and he said, I think that guy would make a great bishop. And that startled the guy, and he had to give up chewing tobacco. He said he had to give up the habit of chewing tobacco, and then he became an excellent bishop.
Wow.
So,
I love those stories. You could almost make a whole book about those, the cigarette smoking people.
Oh yeah.
That became bishops like the week after, right? And had to
I love
quit
it.
these things. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's why those are a few stories that I love from there, but also just show how he was with people and how people loved him. And he was also very, very like prophetic. Like he would say stuff and then just trust it would happen. Like there was a time he was blessing a lady that was about to go into labor, and he blessed her with a healthy son. And after it was over, she went in to see the child. She goes, but Elder Taylor, it's a girl. He's like, a girl? No, it can't be that. And he's just like, no, that's not true. That's not true. And then after a pause, he's like, oh, twins. And then a few minutes later, she went into labor again, and the next
no way.
came out. Yeah.
Oh, wow. I guess that was, we're so used to obviously knowing when there's two babies in there or more, right?
Yeah, so you would find out. At the time, you wouldn't know that there would be another one or another child coming. And that was one of those. Those circumstances.
Now, I'm curious just with the format of the book. Is it just sort of, is it like like a biography written like just story after story, or just talking about different stages of his life? Or is there, how does he format the book?
Okay, so that's interesting. It's an interesting format. It starts out actually with Nellie, his third wife's father, and not wanting to do plural marriage, and then has a revelation, and then becomes, and he does. And then it's mostly about Nellie at the beginning, and you hear, it's almost like Jaws. You know how in Jaws you never see the shark?
Yeah.
But you hear
the very end, right?
Yeah. Like middle of, you see the shark, but you're seeing like barrels, in the water go down and stuff like that. It's almost like that. You're almost in Nellie's position. Like she heard about John Taylor before she ever met him. And then because one, he's polygamous, and two, because he's polygamous when the underground was happening, when the Edmund Tucker Act was, a lot of times he couldn't be there. And so he would show up just, and then for a while it wouldn't be, and it might be about Nellie for a while. He takes her when he's the mission president in Denver. So a lot of stories about that. And anyways, interesting structure. And it gives you, it makes you want to know more, because there's a lot that's not in there, because you know what I mean? Samuel Taylor didn't have that information. So
he wasn't, there's only one Wilford Woodruff who like recorded every day in detail, right?
Oh, so, yeah, exactly. Like Wilford Woodruff, everything, everything. So,
interesting.
So,
well, where should we go next?
Okay. So there is a kind of a fun prophecy about Canada. He was over Cardston area. And when it was first starting, he saw in a vision what it would be one day. And he was talking to people, or he was in a speech about, giving a talk in church about it, and he would talk about how, how there would be, cattle and everything there, and he would talk about how this town would be this close. And back then it was very sparse and it was kind of a bleak place. And so people are like, oh, whoa,
Well,
okay.
it still is kind of sparse.
Oh, is that, I've never been there.
Oh,
I have
yeah,
never
I
been
mean,
there.
I visited there once, and it was funny. I checked into a hotel in Cardston, right? And the lady
Uh-huh.
behind the desk was very kind and doing things. And then we went to a temple session a few hours later, and the
Yeah.
lady at the front desk was in our temple session.
Oh,
It
she
was
was?
like,
Oh, how
had
cool
a
is
very
that?
much like a small town feel. So
Yeah. Okay.
anyway,
Very good. So, but the one thing he did say at the end there was, he goes, and if you stay here, there will be a time when you can have breakfast in Cardston and dinner in Salt Lake City. And everybody's like, how could that even be possible?
yeah.
At the time. But Nellie, before she died, and she lived a long time, after he died, people would see her and they would say, hey, by the way, I was there when he said that you'd have breakfast in Cardston and dinner, or maybe it was lunch. It might have even been that. But, this was before the Wright brothers. This is before flights. You realized
Mhm.
you could move so quickly. And
Wow.
so, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a prophecy. You can do that,
Yeah.
especially on an airplane. Probably not via I-15, but
No. And I
yeah,
don't know how far it is driving. I'm not sure if you can do it in a day.
yeah, it's a good drive. So
Is it? Okay. I've
yeah,
got to get up there. I've got to
yeah,
get
it's
up
worth a visit. It's a cool temple
there.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah. So,
cool.
yeah.
And is if there's any questions that pop up here, Bryan is the expert. He knows every last
No,
page
no.
of this book. No,
Well, I've read it
uh,
a few times and I love it. That's
oh, cool.
absolutely true. That is
Yeah,
absolutely true.
but yeah, if there's any you know blank area that we can fill in here, we can
Yeah. If you got any questions,
throw
I'll
it at
do my
Bryan.
best
So
to answer. Yeah. I'll do my best to answer.
cool.
So, yeah. Yeah. And so at the end of his life, so with the Edmunds Tucker Act, and well, before I say this, so whenever I hear like tough stuff, I love the tough parts of history, because I love seeing where God's hand is in it, and I
Mhm.
really believe I want everybody to know that I absolutely believe that the Lord guides this church, and that it's run by revelation. And I know because I felt that at the local councils. I've had ward councils where we've felt the guidance and of the Lord. And I know if we're feeling it at the local levels, they're feeling it. They're the same things happening in Salt Lake City. And so the way I look at the tough history in our church is I came up with this the other day. It's the ward council lens of viewing history, which is that you've got the guidance of the Lord, and the Lord gives you principles and commandments, and then we as people have to implement it the best we can. And sometimes you struggle with it, and sometimes you try to do it and it doesn't work, so you have to go back to the Lord and try it again. And I've seen that in at the local level. That happens at the ward council. You counsel together, you try something, you go to the Lord, and I think that when I look at the tough stuff in history, I think it's a lot of people trying to do the best they can and trying to change. And I think the end of polygamy was a tough time.
Yeah.
For people. It was a really, really tough time. And so after the manifesto, there was still some confusion, right?
Mm.
So people are like, well, does that mean just in America? And when we go to Canada or Mexico, can we still practice polygamy? And there was some confusion about whether we would just stop for a little bit and then we'd start again. And so John Taylor he did have other wives after the manifesto. And eventually he was asked to step down from it. And actually, David O. McKay was his replacement.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, well, people didn't know him back then. Like that was David O. McKay was one of the ones that people are like, oh, who's that guy? I wonder, because he was just a teacher up in.
I love those details because you see, I mean, obviously David O. McKay had a huge impact on the church, being the prophet for so long, and we don't realize. I mean, it could have been, I don't know, like just these things happen, and suddenly that spot's open, and that that individual steps in to then lead to a really impactful life in
Yeah.
in the church. So
Who really made the church a global church and really, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But at the time, he was I mean, people knew, well, people in Weber definitely knew who he was, but at church wide, it was like, oh, I wonder who this nice young man is.
So did and I don't again I don't expect you to know all these questions, but
Yeah.
did you get the impression, like, obviously he's in the Quorum of the 12, so I imagine he's living in Salt Lake, during
Yes.
his time in the Quorum of the 12?
Yes. When he was a member, he did have houses. I think he had a house in Farmington for a while. Um, all of his wives had different houses and lived in different areas. But as soon as he was let out of the quorum, he moved to Provo, and that's where he lived, and that's where he spent the rest of his life.
So he wasn't like, there's some, in Mexico and Canada where some, colonies of polygamy were happening. And I don't know, I think it was a little more gray area, if I remember, as far as the history after the manifesto, right? It was sort of like, well, we're still figuring this out. But I mean, if you're in Salt Lake, it was pretty clear from what I understand that, no, we're done with this. Like, we're done.
Yes.
Right.
Right. And well, for a while there, it wasn't completely clear. It was definitely messy. It was definitely messy. But he was an apostle for quite some time after the manifesto. But when it became clear that he was not going to stop, that he wasn't going to stop, and he really believed it. I mean, he believed it completely. They asked him to step down, and then he
stepped down from the Quorum of the 12, right?
From the Quorum of the 12, yeah.
And they didn't excommunicate him at that point.
Not at that point, although he did later. They did excommunicate him later because he took another wife, and it was just against the religion at that point.
Right.
It was against the religion, and also John W. Taylor was a known person at the time, and so there could not be any idea that the church was like hushing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Letting it be, because he was everybody knew who he was at the time.
Yeah. So, I mean, he had a deep conviction that the manifesto was not God's will, I guess you could say. Like, this practice needed to continue, or how would you frame it?
See, that's a good question. That's a good question. That's a very, very good question. He believed. It's unclear, to be honest with you, because there's things he said later on that lead you to believe that he absolutely knew that he was not an apostate in the way that he absolutely believed that Wilford Woodruff was a prophet, and that the keys were still in the church, and that this was Christ's church and God's church. As a matter of fact, there's a really good story, because so the thing to remember about him is he loved people, and people loved him. And now that he wasn't an apostle, this was actually before the excommunication, a minister came to visit him and said, I have a business proposition for you. And he was like, oh, let's talk about that. And the guy said, I would love for you to come and preach at my church. And the minister said, the hardest people to convert are Mormons, is how he put it, as you know. But with you coming over, well, we can really show. I think it was unfair what the church did to you. He said, he played on his vanity, and he talked to him for a while. Let me find really quick.
Yeah, no, take time if you need to find it. Okay.
And so he said to the clergyman, and this is why John Taylor, this is one of the two stories here at the end that just, he's a hero to me. He's an absolute hero to me, because I think it's hard to lose a pulpit if that's what you're really good at. And it was painful. It was very, very painful to have to step down.
Yeah.
And he said to the minister, he said, after the minister said, we'll be able to show, the church what they did was bad, and that, the minister was really playing up that. And it says, at last Father's frozen face melted. It showed enthusiasm and zest. He arose and grasped the minister's hand. Thank you, sir. You've taken a great burden from me. You are the answer to a prayer. And the minister's like, oh, I knew you would accept. You'd be a fool not to. And then he was like, accept. And he's like, do you have the slightest idea I would deny the gospel? As a very young man, I had a powerful testimony that my life would be spent in its work. And then he said, I've been baffled and sorely tried. I don't, he was telling how he didn't understand what was going on. But now he understands. If I have the opportunity to split the church, my mission is to set an example that will sustain the faith of the people. The church is larger than any one man in it. If my downfall is a test to the people, I will do everything I can to make the test not too severe. I will not take a rival pulpit. I will not join apostate groups. I will not join with the bitter and dissatisfied. From now on, I can do more for the church outside of it than in. And so he considered his mission at that point was to not cleave the church, was to not do anything that would make people think. And he was very, very eloquent and just charismatic. And but he loved the gospel too much. He loved Christ too much. And so that was it's like, I'm going to be silent. That's my mission right now, is to just be silent.
Wow.
Which I love that integrity.
Yeah.
I love it.
Fascinating. Especially, I mean, you just compare that to 2024 in a social media world. There's several examples where people say, hey, this is my chance to stand on a stage and I've got some attention. I'm going to, really give it to the church, and they've wronged me and on. But wow, to just step back. That's impressive. That's really cool.
It really shows something, because it was a real sacrifice for him to do that, because he was good. He was really, really good. And so I absolutely love him for that.
Yeah. So he never came back to the church?
No, he took another wife after that, and then was excommunicated. At that point, he hadn't been excommunicated.
Okay.
And then he was excommunicated, and he died very, very soon after that. He died very soon after that. And there was one other time. So it wasn't just like a local preacher. There was actually somebody else that was like a fundamentalist who was polygamist and said, look, the church has lost it. You know what I mean? They're apostate. We're the ones that are not. And he tried to convince him that the church was wrong. And John W. Taylor refused to say that. He said, we have a difference of opinion, is how he put it, but that'll be rectified in the next life. You know what I mean? So he refused to say that, but the other guy wanted him to come and join a sect, a fundamentalist sect. And the guy thought he would, because
it seems
the guy
like an easy sell.
It seemed like a really easy sell. Exactly. And actually, this is the one time in the book when John W. Taylor gets angry, actually. He at one point, he just said, and this is when the other guy started saying, the church is apostatized. You are still an apostle. And it says, Father arose, you've said entirely enough, good night. And the other guy goes, but Apostle Taylor, and he goes, my own difficulties with the authorities are strictly personal and private with me. If I was out of harmony, it was my own business and my own responsibility. Any adjustments will be made on the other side, not here. Every apostate claims the church is wrong and he is right. The church has disowned me, but I will never disown my church. I will never join with any bitter group working for its downfall. And then the other guy says, but you're repudiating the principle. And that's when he goes off, John W. Taylor. He says, you're a fine one to talk, and you're betraying. I haven't repudiated the principle, but you have. I will never repudiate the principle, but here and now repudiate all men who try to use it in an attack on the church. Good night, sir. And he kicked the guy out. And his wife, Nellie, said, well, you're all alone now, John. And his response was, no reason to run with bad company. And so that was the end of his life. He had two chances to become, if he had, any personal aggrandizement, he had two chances to do it, and he would have been successful. He would have absolutely been successful in that sphere. And so there's something about those two things that just touches me. So he's my hero. He's one of my heroes. And if you'd have told me that somebody that was excommunicated and I knew nothing about it, I'd be very surprised. If you'd then say, but he'll be one of your heroes when you learn about him. But he really is. Those two things just touch me to no end.
That's cool. That's cool. And it looks like I'm just on his Wikipedia page here. So he had six wives total.
Yes.
And I guess it's curse of being such a good-looking guy. I mean, you're just
Well,
attracting the ladies.
well, I'll tell you this as well. Okay,
Okay.
so all of his wives were very they were very attractive, and not that that's important or anything, but they were also very engaging. Like people loved him.
Oh
People
yeah.
absolutely loved him. And so after he passed away, they had ample opportunity to remarry. They had a lot of suitors, but there's something about John W. Taylor. He was like I think Samuel Woolley Taylor calls him like a human rocket. Like, how are you going to marry somebody after him? And so none of them did, but they spent the rest of their life. I think one worked at the Utah hospital or the Pioneer Hospital, if that was. Anyways, whatever hospital Pioneer Hospital became, if it maybe it was that they worked there many years. They were temple workers. You know what I mean? They were temple workers, and yeah, they lived out their life faithfully.
So that's fascinating. I just wonder how it worked back then. I mean, he was excommunicated, but his wives were not excommunicated, even
No,
though they were entering into plural marriage with him. Right?
yeah, no, they weren't. It was just him. Well,
Huh.
I'm not 100% sure about that. To be honest, well, obviously, if they had been, they were reinstated later.
Yeah, yeah. But they were
Because
faithful till the end.
they were faithful to
His
the end.
wives, right?
Yeah, yeah, and in the same way that he was, like after that, they were just regular members of the church. You know what I mean? They weren't like we should go, join another sect or something like that. They just finished out. They raised their boys, all their boys, in the church, and yeah, well, and boys and girls, their sons and daughters.
Yeah.
So,
And do you know which wife Samuel came from? Or
yeah, it was the third one. It was Nellie.
oh, okay. So that's what he starts the book talking about his mother. Then
Yeah, it was his
okay.
mother's family that he starts with, and it was the second wife. I forget her name. That they did a lot of. They were ready to write a book. So there's all this information somewhere. That family probably has it. Man, I hope they write that book someday. I really would like
Right?
to. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
And then does it tell much about? I mean, so even though I imagine by the time John W. Taylor was stepped down as an apostle and then was excommunicated, his Samuel was maybe in his adult years, so he'd sort of had his own faith journey at that point before he went to Hollywood. Did I lose you? Am I frozen or are you frozen? Can you hear me, Brian? Hello, hello. Well, that's too bad. Am I frozen or just him? Oh, good. You can hear me. Well, here we are. Let's see if Brian jumps back on here. Brian is frozen. He is frozen to me. We're just seeing if you're paying attention, and you are. All right, he's logged off. That means he's probably giving a good refresh. Anything we're missing here? Any question or thing? We're obviously about to wrap up. But any question that you would want me to make sure I ask Brian when he jumps back on here? And I'll show you this here. I'm on his his Wikipedia page. I love coming to Wikipedia and going through the Quorum of the 12 because it'll show like the times they served and then why it ended. Obviously, usually it's because they die, but here it is: resigned from the Quorum in opposition to the Church's stance against polygamy. Had 6 kids. Died of stomach cancer. Oh, there's a nice picture for you. At the age of 58, I mean, for someone who had become an apostle and then removed from the Quorum, 58 is a young age. So, grave marker. Well, there you have it. Brian's not jumping on. I hope everything's okay. I'm sure it was just an internet feed thing. So I tried to stall for you, Brian. So, yeah, someone, let's see here. Cameron is asking here, what was the relationship like between Elder Matthias Cowley, also dropped from the Quorum of the 12 around the same time? I mean, it was just a wild time at that point, right? Dissent and disagreement and mixed up the quorum. But I think back then they were just sort of used to it, where, during Joseph Smith's time, they were just, it was a revolving door at some points, right? So, all right, well, let me see if I can have a message from him here. Dave Lefevre, he's helping me out. Interesting stuff. The Post Manifesto time is a very interesting time to study. Saints does a good job. Yeah, if you haven't read the Saints volumes, they are worth your time. I love this. I mean, I love early church history, obviously, but it's almost like we've heard it so much. Like even in the Saints series, I sort of just forced myself to get through the volume 1 of the Saints because I've heard a lot of those stories with the plates, the Restoration, Joseph Smith. But man, volume 2, talking about Wilford Woodruff, and talk about a leadership book. Like, I think the story of Wilford Woodruff, of him making the decision to do the manifesto. I mean, it was a lose situation between him and the government, between him and the body of saints. But he took a bold action, and I think with hindsight, obviously was the right call. So, but yeah, I agree, Dave. That volumes 2 and 3 are mostly unknown history of Latter-day Saints, and I believe there's just one more volume that they're going to write before they wrap that up. Let's see. Oh, I got a text from him. He says, "It looks like my internet is down. I'm trying to fix it." Oh man. Oh. John says, joining late. Do we talk about the age that he was ordained? That's a good question. He said it was young, I think in his mid-20s. So let's do the math, shall we? Let me pull this up here. Oh. So he was ordained as apostle in 84. He was born in 58. So 20, is that 26? Ah, yes. Very good. So yeah, 26 years old. I think wasn't David O. McKay in his mid 20s as well. So yeah, young apostle, was an apostle for about 20 years. And then stepped down. So, and then David O. McKay took the reins here. Let's look at, because so 1905, and then David O. McKay was an apostle, 1906. So very cool. All right. Kimberly says, what did John W. Taylor do for employment to care for his families? That would be a good question. Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff. Oh, Brian just tried to call me, but oh, here he is.
Hi.
He's back, folks.
My internet went off.
I ran out of jokes. I ran out of stories. I just began to make facts up about John W. Taylor. So,
well, thank you for doing that, because that was a long time, man. That took forever.
Yeah, well, it's good. Hey, we're patient. We'll know you'll get back on here. So, all right, there's a few questions here that maybe will give you a jumping off point. How about this one?
Sure.
Was the relationship like with Elder Matthias Cowley, also dropped from the Quorum of the 12 around the same time? Did it mention anything like that, or is anything coming to mind?
Yeah, they're best friends, actually. They grew up together, and they went on a mission. It was either to the same place or close by. And John W. Taylor wrote him a letter that said, you'll be a member of the 12 one day. And it turned out to be true. But yeah, they loved each other. And Matthias Cowley was a good guy. There was when his son, Matthew Cowley, who became an apostle, was thinking about not getting married in the temple because his dad couldn't go. And his dad was like, no, you're getting married in the temple, and he, And so, yeah, I have a lot of respect for Matthias Callie. But yeah, they were good friends. They were very, very good friends.
Yeah, so he dropped out of the Quorum in 1905 as well. Isn't that when
Same
so
time. Yeah,
same time
exact same
resigned from
time.
the Quorum because of
Yeah,
opposition?
and he was never excommunicated. I think he was disfellowshipped, but I don't think he was ever excommunicated.
It makes me wonder. I wonder if he, and maybe you know this, if he took on additional wives after the manifesto,
No.
and maybe that was it, right? That I disagree with the church, I can't be a part of this quorum, but as long as you don't take on extra
Yeah.
wives, then you won't be excommunicated. So that's
Yeah,
fascinating.
yeah, I think that's definitely it. And he was very faithful, and he came back. He eventually came back, and I think he was a missionary. Like he and his wife did a senior couple missionary or something.
Hmm.
I'm fuzzy on that, but there was something like that.
Yeah, because
Like
this is interesting. Here it says, he's a member of the Quorum of 12 till 1905, but he was an LDS Church apostle till 1911. So
yeah, yeah,
maybe he kept the office, but was kicked out of the quorum. That's interesting.
yeah. I'm not sure about that. That's a good question. That's a
Yeah.
good question. Why?
Well, I wonder if
I'll have
there's
to
a
look
book
into that.
out there, Brian. You have to put it on your list. So,
There's not about him. There is about
oh
his
boy,
son, who was a crackerjack. His son was hilarious.
was the son of an apostle, or
He was, yeah.
oh, cool.
Yeah,
Okay.
and he was a missionary in the southern or the South Pacific, and he has stories of miracles that are almost like other side of
Uh-huh.
heaven good.
Oh,
I
that's
mean, it's
cool.
really, yeah, it's interesting family.
All right. What about this question here?
Yeah,
What did John W. Taylor do for employment to care for his families?
so he was actually super interesting. His business dealings. He was very, very like he was honest to a fault. He was absolutely honest to a fault, but he was also somebody that would see he would see a business opportunity, he would go for it. He would just go for it, and sometimes it worked out, sometimes it didn't. Jesse Knight, you might know the Jesse Knight building at BYU,
Uh-huh.
but he was wealthy, very, very wealthy member, and he said, "You know what? I can set you up uh, so that you just have to worry about." Business dealings. You just have to worry about, or not business dealings. You just have to worry about preaching and doing what you do good. This is when he was an apostle, and I'll just make sure, because back then apostles, they had to make their own money as well.
Mhm.
And John W. Taylor is like, "Oh, I'm not ready to give up my free agency," and he should have done it. He totally should have done it, and but he didn't, and so he did the best he could, and sometimes he did very, very well, but he would lose it. And after he was let out of the quorum, the funniest part of the book, when you read it, you've got to read, there's a section where he becomes a ladder salesman, and it's a ladder without rungs. Little it has like little steel foot things, and you just sort of slide it up, and then it'll slide down, and when it works, but when it didn't, it was a death trap. And so Samuel Woolley Taylor became the main salesman, but only really what he got was all the children wanting to play on it, and it terrified like all the adults in the neighborhood. Like it is the funniest story I think in any LDS history book ever. Is the
That's
story
cool.
about the ladder. Kills me. So
Nice. Love it. All right. Well, if any final questions, put them in the comments. But Brenda, any final
yeah,
story or thing that you wanted to share before we wrap up, or did we
yeah.
do a
I
good job?
I want to tell just one more thing.
Yeah.
At the end of his life, he died very young, like in his early 50s or mid 50s or
We
something.
looked it up. It was 58. So
Oh, okay, late 50s
of
then. So
stomach cancer, at least Wikipedia says that. So
yeah, no, it was cancer. I didn't realize it was stomach cancer, but I knew it was cancer. Um, but there's a really, really touching description of his passing, and it was with his sixth wife that he was there, and he'd been sick for a while, and so he was gray, and he was had a wasted countenance, is what
mm,
Samuel Woolley Taylor, how he put it. And he says, "Ellen, do I need a shave?" And his wife said, "No, John, you never need a shave." And he goes, "Get a damp cloth and wash my face. I feel grimy." So she washed his face, and then he asked her to comb his hair, and she combed his hair. And he says, "Do I look all right, Ellen?" And she said, "Yes, John." And he asked for a mirror, and he looked in the mirror, and he goes, "Will you smooth my mustache?" And she smoothed his mustache. And Samuel Woolley Taylor talks about he was always meticulous,
mm.
always about really important to him to make a good first impression. And now he was ready. And then his wife Ellen said, "John," And he said, hush, like that. And the way they describe, all of a sudden, it was for a second. And you hear this with people that are about to pass away, is all of a sudden they're very lucid and you almost see them as they were younger. And that happened with him. Like Ellen could see how he used to be on the rostrum and preaching and the Spirit. And he goes, hush, hush, he whispered, the Savior is passing. And then Samuel Willie Taylor says, and the light died away as he followed him. And I mean, for this to be in a nationally published book, for the son to be able to write that about his father, I just love that. I love that ending right there. So
that's cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, this is a fun way to honor someone like John W. Taylor, who is obviously very forgotten. You don't hear that name in seminary too often. So
no,
that was cool.
No, you don't. And I honestly think if it didn't end up the way it did, we'd remember him the same way we remember J. Golden Kimball. I honestly think we would.
Yeah. And I think we'll all watch, or when we hear about Flubber or the Nutty Professor, we will appreciate it just a little bit more. So
that's absolutely right. It comes from a grandson of a prophet and the son of an apostle.
That's cool. All right. Well, we'll end it there and maybe tease us. So you've done things like Howard W. Hunter. You're doing Orson Hyde right now over on X, so people can read more about these stories there. But I'd love to do this again if you're up to it. And it can even be an apostle that you have already done on X. It doesn't. Might as well. You did all the work once. Might as well share about it here. So if we do this again, what are 2 or 3 apostles where you'd like to go?
Oh, there's George Albert Smith, John Henry Smith, and George A. Smith were father, son, grandson that were apostles.
Oh, wow.
And I don't know that you could fill a whole hour. You could with George Albert Smith for sure. Such good stories there. But all 3 of them have some tremendous stories, and I think it might be fun to
that's interesting
to go through them. They're really good.
So the prophet George Albert Smith is where was he in that? Was he the grandson?
He was the grandson. His father was John Henry Smith, and it was the only time a father and son were in the quorum of the 12 at the same time, served in the same quorum. Was the 2 of them, and there were people that were in the father in the first presidency in quorum, but the only time
like
2, and then
Joseph Fielding Smith, right? And Joseph F. Smith, maybe.
He was in the first presidency, so they worked very closely together. But I think that would be a fun one. I love M. Russell Ballard. Oh, good gravy! His biography just brings me to tears. I love that book.
Yeah, that's great.
He'd be good. Spencer W. Kimball, good gravy. Spencer W. Kimball would be awesome. So.
Yeah,
no, they're all good. I love them all.
Okay,
I absolutely love them all.
Well, let's do this again, and we'll just keep exploring the lives of these apostles. And it's not like there's like this specific leadership principle, but just for hearing these stories, those principles come through. We can feel them and interpret them just from these stories. So that's cool.
Oh yeah,
awesome. All right, well, we'll end it here.
All right. Well, thank you.